One of the many comments that has been used to demonise Lucy Letby since she was first accused of harming babies at the Council of Chester was the idea that she's cold and unemotional. This was, to some extent, communicated in court reporting of the time. It's something that's been particularly attributed to Judith Moritz, who has just made these comments about her being blank and otherwise difficult to read, which I found her whole attitude to be, frankly, deeply unprofessional and also lacking in empathy, because it's quite obvious to me that Lucy was in a deeply traumatised state by this point, and it's known that she was suffering with PTSD. It's known that she was on medication. She'd had a breakdown and the trial was delayed for that reason. So I found Moritz's attitude to be both bizarre and, as I say, quite unprofessional really for a journalist. However, another comment regarding Lucy being supposedly unemotional came from Nicola Lightfoot, who was a ward manager at the Countess of Chester. It's not actually true that she failed a nurse placement for being cold. That's an incorrect headline. But Nicola Lightfoot made these comments about Lucy not exuding a natural warmth from which that she would expect from a children's nurse. Now, one of my first comments about this before we go into assessing its accuracy would be that it's fairly extraordinary to me that Nicola Lightfoot recalls such trivial details that occurred over a decade ago. Most people will find that their memory, in fact, I'd say it's almost universal that memory will decay and deteriorate over a period of time, and our impression of incidents becomes less clear the further the larger amount of time that passes between the incident and the present. So for Nicola Lightfoot to have such clarity over what appear to be completely trivial incidents is frankly extraordinary, and I would suggest that something has just simply come into her mind, and this is not a deliberately invented recollection, but it's one that has been seeded by the vast amount of media coverage and Lucy Letby's court case and the guilty verdict. I think the reliability of this account is extremely dubious before we even look at all the evidence that contradicts the assertion that Lucy is or was cold and unemotional. I will also mention that at the time of these comments from Lightfoot, Lucy was very young, in her early 20s, and it's very common at that age to be shy. We can as we sort of progress in life, we can tend to forget that the transition from adolescence into adulthood can be a very challenging time. We find ourselves in the adult world for the first time, and we may be intellectually prepared for it, but experientially and in terms of confidence, it can be very difficult. And we often forget the way we were at that time. It's perfectly normal to be a little bit quiet, a little bit reticent, and a little bit shy during that period of our lives. And there's actually evidence that supports that with regard to Lucy. And this would hardly be a revelation if she was just a little bit quiet and a little bit shy during that period of her life, and that this has been essentially misinterpreted as coldness. And this is a comment from Eirian Powell regarding Lucy, indicating that she switches from days to nights to suit the unit as required, described as very amenable and flexible, one of her best nurses, and that she'd previously been a student in the department and was, quote, quiet but diligent. So she interpreted that quietness in a completely different way, and I think, frankly, a considerably more accurate way. So these are comments made by Lucy's friend Dawn Howe, speaking on the BBC Panorama programme. And she was asked by Judith Moritz whether Lucy always knew that she wanted to do nursing. So I'll quote what Dawn said. Yeah, it was the only career that I ever remember her saying that she wanted to go and do. She had had a difficult birth herself, and she was very grateful for being alive to the nurses that would have helped save her life. So I feel like everything that she did was geared towards that ultimate goal of becoming a nurse. She was doing the job that she loved and the job that she's always wanted to do. So that's hardly indicative of someone who's unemotional. Lucy obviously felt grateful towards these nurses that had saved her, and so she wanted to go into a similar profession, into the same profession essentially, and help young children. That this is not indicative of someone that's cold, it's not indicative of someone that's unemotional, it's indicative of the exact opposite. So this is a quote from Karen Rees when she was interviewed by the Sunday Times in February 2025. And she recounts Lucy crying frequently, asking why consultants on the ward are doing this to her, insisting that she's done nothing wrong and that she's not going to allow them to run her out of a job that she loves. Now, firstly, indicating that she loves the job is a kind of emotional thing in itself. It's an emotional indication of an attachment to a profession and to a vocation. Obviously, Lucy crying and being very upset and being very, very distressed and very hurt by what's happening is emotional. And the fact that she cares so much about nursing and wants to be involved in it is indicative of empathy, which is a type of emotional intelligence, really. So again, that all goes completely against this notion that Lucy is cold or unemotional, which frankly is a pretty absurd assertion in the first place. I mean, it simply doesn't apply to most nurses. Now, Cheshire Police went to enormous lengths to dig up any dirt that they possibly could on Lucy. They excavated her entire life. As you can see here, they even searched her garden, her guttering. I think this was a pretty transparent attempt to create images for the media, as has been suggested by Peter Hitchens. And yet, despite this effort, they singularly failed to dig up any dirt on her whatsoever. You know, she's almost implausibly squeaky clean, just a very pure-natured person that obviously had no darkness in her life at all. And there's no suggestion of any psychological unhealthiness. You know, she's been psychologically assessed as part of the police interviews. She had close friends. She had good relationships with her colleagues. There was no indication whatsoever that there was anything even remotely unhealthy about Lucy in any way, let alone that she would be cold or unemotional to the extent that it would be some form of psychological disorder. So this is a quotation from the New Yorker article by Rachel Aviv, where a detective with Cheshire Police states that it's completely unprecedented in that there doesn't seem to be anything to say about why Letby would kill babies. There really isn't anything we have found in her background that's anything other than normal. Similarly, when speaking with BBC Panorama, Dawn Howe, her close friend, described her as the most kind, gentle, soft friend. She's the kindest person I've ever known. She would only want to help people. Another friend of Lucy's described her as joyful and peaceful, whereas Howe stated in the same documentary that Lucy had dedicated her entire life to working as a nurse after this incident mentioned earlier. She described her determination to become a nurse as steadfast and singular, and that this had dated back to an age that even preceded adolescence. All of this is indicative of someone that is not only emotionally normal and emotionally well adjusted, but actually quite an emotional, kind, empathic, emotionally sensitive person. So I haven't spoken to anyone who knows Lucy personally, but I have spoken to a couple of people that are well acquainted with her social circle from the Countess of Chester, and they all recount the fact that everyone considered her to be completely normal. You know, she socialised with people. She actually went on holidays with people that she worked with. She was popular on the unit. She was considered to be a very friendly person. And there's just no indication of any emotional dysfunction, let alone coldness. And this is then reflected in the statements that I've read out in previous videos that were submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry, where approximately 20 nurses all state, we never had any problems with Lucy, we never suspected there were any issues with Lucy. And a few of those nurses also, even to the Thirlwell inquiry, indicated their belief in her innocence. And I suspect that there are more than those that spoke out in those statements. During the court process, as I mentioned, Judith Moritz tried to indicate her brilliant deduction that Lucy was difficult to read or lacking in somehow lacking in outward emotion or outward personality. Whereas you have to understand that her life had been completely torn apart, and naturally she was struggling to process everything that had happened to her. And she was also going through the incredibly stressful situation of this court case, knowing that people were judging her every day and knowing that the outcome could be that she went to prison for the rest of her life. I mean, it's not perhaps surprising that she wasn't as emotionally responsive as she usually would be. And also, she did display outward emotion, crying on several occasions during the court case. So I think the assessment of Judith Moritz and others that have since jumped on the bandwagon since the court case was completed was wholly unreasonable, and I think ultimately just really poor journalism. Another thing to mention about Lucy is that she was an animal lover. I'll move on to talk about her cats in a second, but it's first notable that she had a Yorkshire Terrier when she was young, and that dog was actually called Whiskey, and she doted on that dog and was described as really, really loving the animal. And again, that's simply indicative of empathy, kindness, the sort of qualities that you would associate with someone who went on to become a highly regarded nurse at the Countess of Chester. Lucy had also been completely isolated from her friends on the unit and also her animals. So Dawn Howe, a friend, was one of several people to mention these cats that she's rescued. And this is actually the Instagram page that she set up for Tigger and Smudge that she was running before she was so sadly arrested. I mean, it's truly tragic and horrendous to look at this. You know, and you just see I don't know if we can find some other images, but somewhere down here there's some reference to Disney, and she was just obviously a very pure soul, really. Very girly in her ways, I would say. Although obviously must have been a tough, strong person as well, because you don't work on a neonatal unit unless you can deal with some very difficult situations. But I think there was clearly a great softness in her, and certainly someone that is an animal lover, it's very hard to throw accusations of them of being unemotional. Fundamentally, if you connect with an animal or if you love animals generally, it's indicative of kindness and empathy and warmth and all these positive emotions. So it's really very, very sad to look at this and to see. I mean, I know for myself, I'll try not to cry talking about this, but if I you know, went to prison, I couldn't be with my dog, and you know, she passed away without me. It doesn't even bear thinking about. I mean, I'll be absolutely devastated. I mean, I honestly think I'd do okay in prison if you put me in solitary confinement. I'll be absolutely fine. The one thing, probably two things, is I'd hate the food because I like good food, and also just to be without my dog would be devastating. And to know that I wasn't going to be there for her, I just couldn't bear it. So, I mean, that must have been awful for Lucy. And as I say, it's just completely inconsistent with the notion that she's cold and unemotional. So during the BBC Panorama documentary, Professor David Wilson, who has also made some very strange statements and still considers Lucy to be guilty, so this strengthens this statement even further, was asked by Judith Moritz whether or not Lucy resembles a typical serial killer. That's pretty damned obvious that she doesn't, but he still confirmed this anyway. He said she's very social, she's very socialised, she has friendship groups, she has people in the hospital who befriended her, mentored her, she's somebody that's seen not suspiciously, there's no evidence that she's fascinated by serial killers. I'll return to this later, but all of the evidence points to the fact that she's nothing like any serial killer that you would typically encounter in any way. And this was one of the initial red flags for me as someone that has a kind of amateur interest in criminology. And I do hope to make a video in the future. It's on my list, hopefully in the relatively near future, about how serial killers will express themselves in their writing and some of the contrast between this and Lucy, which I think is an interesting topic. So I've studied a few people that have committed what you might call extreme crimes in considerable depth. So I think it would be interesting to take a look at that at some point in the future. So this book by Judith Moritz and Jonathan Coffey, among the many poorly founded accusations made in this book was the suggestion that Lucy had borderline personality disorder. And this was repeated here in this interview of Coffey and Moritz by the Independent newspaper. So we see here this comment about borderline personality disorder, or BPD, is another theory that's been floated to make sense of Letby's mental condition. BPD is a disorder of mood and how a person interacts with others. Emotionless reactions are one red flag for the condition. This does chime with what we witnessed of Letby in court over the course of both trials. Her demeanour was studiedly blank. Her frumpy clothes in muted colours, drab hair and blank expression all seemed designed to deflect interest and say nothing. Leaving aside the fact that we've already assessed this emotionless state and this state of trauma I would suggest she was in, I think the last couple of sentences are borderline misogynistic and frankly despicable. I think it's appalling to make these comments about her having frumpy clothes and drab hair. Would we make any such comments about a male defendant? Did anyone say that about Nick Johnson? Did anyone mention the fact that, you know, he's not going to win any beauty contest anytime soon, is he? No, of course not, because it's not relevant. I think we'd only speak about a woman in this way. We never, you know, when Wayne Couzens was in court for the rape and murder of Sir Everard, did people say, oh, I didn't like the suit that he wore, or, you know, he was going bald, or anything like that? No, of course they didn't. I think it's disgusting for this to be written in what is supposed to be a serious newspaper, leaving aside the fact that the suggestion of borderline personality disorder is complete rubbish, as we will now address. So borderline personality disorder is a mental health condition characterised by significant emotional instability, disturbed patterns of thinking, impulsive behaviour and intense but unstable relationships. It's a complex disorder that can significantly impact a person's life and relationships. So this is a summary of the typical behaviours that you would expect to see with regard to borderline personality disorder. The first one is emotional instability. Individuals with BPD experience intense mood swings, difficulty controlling anger, and chronic feelings of emptiness. None of those can be applied to Lucy Letby. She was clearly a very calm person. She was notably described as good in a crisis. There's no evidence of mood swings, let alone chronic feelings of emptiness. She clearly was very motivated and clearly had derived real meaning from her work. She's the opposite of someone that's emotionally unstable. The second thing is disturbed thinking and perception. This can include cognitive distortions, perceptual distortions, and difficulty separating reality from fancy. There's simply no evidence for this whatsoever. Impulsive behaviour. BPD can manifest as impulsive spending, substance abuse, unsafe sex, reckless driving, and self-harm. Again, there is absolutely zero evidence of any of these behaviours in Lucy Letby. Intense and unstable relationships. People with BPD may have intense but fragile relationships, struggle with intimacy, and have a fear of abandonment. That's a harder one to assess, because Lucy would really need to go to undergo psychological assessment in order for us to know that. What we can say is that there's no evidence of unstable relationships. She had very good long-term relationships with friends, and she had good relationship with colleagues on the unit. So there's no evidence that her relationships were, as is suggested here, particularly intense, and certainly not unstable. The next one is distorted self-image. Individuals with BPD may have a fragile sense of self, struggling with identity and purpose. Again, we can say this is categorically untrue. Lucy had a very strong sense of self. She knew exactly who she was. She knew what she wanted to do in life, and she had a very clear sense of purpose and identity. So that could be categorically rejected again. Fear of abandonment. This is a central feature of BPD, often leading to frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. I'd be extremely surprised if Lucy had this fear, given that she had an extremely close relationship with her parents, and she used to go on holiday with them 3 times a year, but yet she was willing to live in a different town to her parents, and she mentioned this explicitly in her writing. So what we know about her is simply not consistent with this whatsoever. And the last one, again, is categorically untrue: self-harm and suicidal behaviour. Self-harm is a common symptom of BPD, and individuals with BPD may have suicidal thoughts or behaviours. Clearly, this is absolutely preposterous to suggest that Lucy was consistent with either of these two very serious conditions. So I've spoken with psychologists and psychiatrists during the research phase for my book, and one in particular stated that although I haven't met Lucy and obviously haven't assessed her, I can say almost categorically that she doesn't have borderline personality disorder. There's simply no evidence to support this. And someone else made a comment to me, another doctor, that it's rather irresponsible for a journalist who has no duty of candour, no professional qualifications. Essentially, there are no consequences for her to make these kind of throwaway remarks about and these amateur diagnoses that are just completely unfounded in any kind of factual, evidential basis. So we've mentioned some of Lucy's colleagues already, but the next thing I'm going to go over is the opinion of people who are close to her and who work with her on the neonatal unit. This is exemplified by this quotation from Karen Rees, who's a nursing manager at the hospital, who was recently interviewed by the Sunday Times. And she said, again, Lucy was quiet but a normal 28-year-old. But when under stress, I can see she goes catatonic almost. People say she's not emotional. Trust me, she is emotional. And then this was a comment from Dr. Lucy Beebe. Submit to the Sociable inquiry. My only memory of the person arrested, Lucy obviously, is seeing her in a side room crying on an occasion, saying it's always me when it happens. And then this is from occupational health representative Kathryn de Beger. We're going to be going over her evidence in some depth, but you can see her talking about Lucy, and she comments she felt distressed and upset, but how much more distressed and upset the parents must be feeling because they had lost their baby. So again, it's not only showing her own emotion, but also showing very strong empathy towards the parents. So I mentioned this article in which the Sunday Times interviewed Karen Rees, and she indicated her belief in Lucy's innocence in this article, and she also spoke a lot about the emotion that Lucy demonstrated during this very distressing period for her. So she said, first of all, that what she saw in Lucy at that time was a very frightened young woman who was shocked and bewildered, as would be a normal reaction under the circumstances. As the investigation into Lucy continued, Rees was given a management instruction to meet the nurse weekly to check on her well-being. Rees described the meetings as shocking. She was crying, very distressed every time we met, saying, "Why is this happening to me?" She kept saying to me, "I'm not going to let them drive me out of the job that I love. I worked hard. I've done nothing wrong." That's what she kept repeating to me. She cried in my arms on a weekly basis. It was harrowing. So I want you to remember that this woman is supposed to be cold and unemotional. Rees added, people say she's not emotional. Trust me, she is emotional. I know that they say psychopaths are clever, but she was acting she deserves an Oscar because she was so convincing. She was really hurt when she was told about the consultant's allegations because she thought they were friends, not just colleagues, and she could not understand why they were doing this to her. So I just want to mention, with regard to this allegation that Lucy is a psychopath, which is not the primary focus of this video, but I may make a video in the future about whether or not she's a psychopath. Frankly, as that is such a ludicrous and completely unfounded allegation, I might not make one. But I just wanted to go over the fact that psychopathic people have great difficulty or are even unable to show empathy and regulate their emotions. According to a new study by Matthias Burkhardt, a Max Planck researcher in Freiburg, this could be because these people suffer from alexithymia, also known as emotional blindness. So no evidence of this in Lucy whatsoever. For example, and then this is a different study. For example, a 2015 study found people higher in psychopathy demonstrated lower levels of brain activity when seeing other people in painful situations. In our study, we found that people higher in psychopathy not only reported feeling less empathy, but also showed lower sweat responses when viewing other people's pain. I mean, this is quite evidently not present in Lucy, who quite obviously feels a lot of empathy and suffers when she sees other people struggling or experiencing pain. So you can say almost immediately that she's not psychopathic. So I think that the suggestion from some that she's some sort of psychopath that somehow fooled people is frankly just completely stupid. So to go back to the Karen Rees interview, I'll just read this paragraph. The 4-page statement was giving her side of the story, Rees said. She said, I haven't done anything wrong. I want to come back to work with you. And at the end of it, I clearly remember, because during this meeting you could hear a pin drop, it said something like, I'm not the cold, calculating murderer that some of you in this room believe me to be. She was trying to touch the hearts of people, I think, to say, please let me just come back to my job. And I'll just repeat this point. She should have gone for constructive dismissal. Someone actually raised a very interesting remark in the comments to me saying, it's not as simple to do that. The hospital will throw all the resources at it they possibly can. But I still think she would have won quite comfortably, considering what had happened to her, and considering that if they'd have provided some evidence, then maybe they would have had to leg to stand on. But given that this case was referred to the police with no evidence, I can't see. She's literally in a room saying, you've accused me of being a murderer. We know for a fact there's no evidence. She won every point of a grievance procedure. She should have just gone for constructive dismissal. I understand why she didn't, but you just cannot go back into a workplace in which people have made these kind of accusations. But clearly this is another indication that she wasn't cold or unemotional. Rees was once again, this is just a misprint from the Sunday Times. Rees was once again given the job of helping Letby return to the unit, but the consultant's body kept throwing things up and it never happened. I remember Lucy's mum phoning me and asking could she meet me in the hospital, and she was crying inconsolably saying, please Karen, don't retire, you're the only one we would trust in this place. So that, again, is very indicative of the fact she should have got out of there. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Challenged on why she believed Letby is innocent, Rees said, the one person that knows her nursing team is the manager or the unit manager, not a consultant that visits a couple of times a week. They know the strengths and weaknesses. I trusted Lucy's ward manager when she looked me in the eye and said, she's fantastic and she's right by the book. She does everything right. And I believed Lucy when she told me she'd done nothing wrong. So the next thing I'm going to move on to is this article from the Daily Telegraph, which interviewed another nurse who worked closely with Lucy, who also spoke favourably of her and towards her, and who believed her to be innocent. And this was quite a long time ago. This was well before the panel convened and all the evidence came up that now looks very strongly as if Lucy's innocent. But in this, what obviously is significant about this article as well is that this nurse tried to support Lucy and give evidence, but was advised against it because it could harm her career. And I think what's happened to Lucy, with witnesses being actively warned against speaking in her favour, the union having done nothing for her whatsoever, the way she's been treated on the unit, before you even go into the police investigation and everything that's happened since then, it's just disgusting It's appalling. It's absolutely appalling. How can you have a situation where people want to be character witnesses and you say, well, you can't be a character witness because we'll destroy your career if you do, because it might make the hospital look bad. I can't imagine the selfishness of someone like that, but we're still seeing that today. It's actually one of the things about this case is, not that I was naive about this at all, but it just makes you realise how selfish and self-centred the world is and can be, with all these organisations like closing ranks and trying to protect their interests when there could be someone in prison, very likely is someone in prison, who's done nothing wrong, who's just rotting away, and they're like, oh, well, it'll make the hospital look bad. And the police are like, well, we've done a crap investigation, but we need to, make it look like we've done a good investigation, otherwise it'll be too damaging for Cheshire Police. And it was like that through across the judiciary, the criminal justice system, the government, even, every level of, right up to the very head of state. People will just try to pretend nothing is wrong and brush it under the carpet, and it's really sad when there is someone's life at stake, their literal liberty and freedom is at stake. And as we're seeing in this video, and we'll see in other videos, essentially this is just a really good person who wanted to work in nursing, who was caring and dedicated and good at what she did. And yet her life has been completely destroyed, and no one cares, because if they cared, it would make them look bad, or it could undermine the organisations that are involved with. And I think that's pretty dark, really. Anyway, in this article, this nurse says, Lucy was always very quiet with people she didn't know, but she adored looking after those babies and building that relationship. She got on really well with families and children, and she used to get a lot of thank you cards from the families. She was always very good at building rapport, and looking after babies was her passion. You could tell as soon as she walked on the ward that she loved it. So that's very much the pattern that we've seen elsewhere. She could be a little bit quiet, she was a little bit shy, very normal behaviour, but you could see that she loved being with infants. She made really good rapports with people. She had good relationships. None of this is even remotely compatible with someone that is cold or unemotional, or that has these psychological disorders that have been asserted completely without evidence. And then she just mentioned here that I'll reiterate that she was approached by lawyers to ask if she'd be a character witness, and talked to her trust about it, was advised it would be better not to, as it could hurt her career, which I just think is completely wrong. So this comment is from Director of Nursing at the Council of Chester, Alison Kelly, who said quite a relatively short statement during one of her comments, was that Lucy had been on since 2012. So that's another thing. She'd worked at the hospital since 2012. Everyone had a good opinion of her. Everyone had a good view of her. Clearly had made no attempt to harm any infants for 3 to 4 years. And then just suddenly, for absolutely no reason, all of a sudden, she just starts supposedly engaging in malignant harm against infants, even though there's no psychological indication that this would occur. There's nothing about her that would raise any red flags. She doesn't reference the murders anywhere. There's no change in her behaviour. There's no change in her manner. It doesn't make any sense, because she's been dedicated her entire life to becoming a nurse. She doesn't benefit from this anyway. There's no motive. But just all of a sudden, after 4 years of working on a unit and being an exemplary nurse, she just starts to deliberately harm babies for absolutely no reason. Anyway, in this comment, it says, on since 2012, perfectly nice, good in a crisis, always there. So it literally goes completely against everything that's been asserted. And this is a comment from Dr. Ravi Jayaram himself, who he also mentioned that Lucy was really good, very calm in a crisis, so not consistent with borderline personality disorder that was discussed earlier. And he also said Lucy was very popular among the nurses, so she had very good relationships with her colleagues. She was friendly with them, she was close to them. This has been well established by now. And this is, just to reiterate something I've said, this was written in a Guardian article. There was no apparent motive and no psychological background that matched a serial killer, and that's crystal clear. So Dr. Richard Taylor also made some comments. He doesn't know Lucy personally, but he made some comments about nurses and nursing during a press conference in December 2024. He said, nursing is an altruistic profession. People don't go into it for the money. They go into it because they want to help other people almost universally. And I think that applies to her. She has no past history of any antisocial behaviour, any criminal behaviour, any psychiatric problems at all. There is no motive. Her friends are all completely astounded, flabbergasted by the accusations that were made against her. That immediately, for me, brought up red flags. And I will just reiterate that I've spoken with someone who has spoken to numerous people among the social circle of Lucy Letby, and they all believe her to be completely normal, as indeed everyone that's come into contact does. People either think she's normal and not in any way memorable, or they're favourable towards her and have positive things to say about her. No one has anything negative to say about her at all. Literally, this Nicola Lightfoot is the only person they could find who had anything negative to say at all. It was still fairly mild criticism, but I think what she said is unfounded, and she's just simply misinterpreted the kind of slightly shy behaviour of a young woman who's still finding her feet, really. And of course, shyness isn't a bad thing. People are shy for all of their lives. It tends to dissipate as you get older. I can remember being very shy when I was young, because you have this experience of stepping into the adult world. You're not an adult. You don't know what to expect. Everyone's older than you. Everyone's more experienced than you. It takes quite a confident person to be in that environment and immediately express their personality and be demonstrably confident externally. It's not. I mean, I guess I did okay when I first had jobs, but for me, it was a difficult transition, a difficult time in my life, and that's true for a lot of people. That's not unusual. I think we tend to forget this as we get older. The last thing I want to discuss in this video is the comments of Kathryn de Beger. It's become clear from the Thirlwell inquiry that Kathryn and Lucy were very close, and I want to go over comments that she has made when speaking with the Thirlwell inquiry and the statement that she submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry. The first thing to note about Kathryn is that it was revealed by sources close to her that the so-called confession note was written on the advice of counsellors, and that ultimately she was the counsellor that was involved in this. There have been some suggestions that she denied this when speaking with the Thirlwell inquiry, but that's categorically untrue. I mean, it's just a lie, basically. She didn't do that at all. We've only seen one of the 8 pages of the statement that she submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry, so we don't know what a full statement was, firstly. And then secondly, she didn't mention the note during her interview that formed part of the Thirlwell inquiry because she simply wasn't asked about it. And I would suggest the lawyers didn't ask her about it because they knew about this article, and the last thing they wanted to do was unearth evidence that would go against the narrative of the inquiry, because there was an obsessive focus on this throughout the inquiry of sticking to the narrative. I've spoken to someone, obviously been through every single document from the Thirlwell inquiry, but I know people that attended, and it goes beyond even what you can see in writing. The attitude of the lawyers towards anyone that attempted to even question the narrative was apparently very hostile. So they didn't ask her about the note, so she couldn't speak about the note. So firstly, I'm going to go over what we do have from the Thirlwell inquiry from Kathryn de Beger. As you can see, this is page 7 of 8. It's document INQ 00179111_07. If anyone wants to search for it. This is just Kathryn de Beger's statement to the Thirlwell inquiry. Unfortunately, we're not privileged enough to see pages 1 to 6 and page 8. But in this statement, she says, "At no time did Lucy tell me anything which required me to contact someone more senior in the hospital or the police. I work under a strict code where if anyone ever tells me anything that is harmful to themselves or others, then I will disclose it to others. I have documented in my notes after meetings with Lucy the general coping advice I gave to her. The notes are all to do with Lucy's welfare, supporting the best I could during an extraordinarily difficult time. Lucy did have some meetings with me on anniversaries of some of the babies' deaths, as she was particularly distressed. Lucy informed me that's why she'd come to see me as she was having a bad week. No specific names were mentioned, and the day of the meeting in my notes would be around an anniversary date of one of the deaths. During these meetings, Lucy did speak to me about the parents of the babies. She felt distressed and upset, but how much more distressed and upset the parents must be feeling because they had lost their babies. These conversations were around the times of the anniversary dates, probably July 2017. Lucy did not mention any parents in particular. She also talked often about the consultants involved. She couldn't understand why they were accusing her. She thought they must hate her so much to do this to her. She talked about consultants Ravi Jayaram and Stephen Breary. I did not document the reason for these visits from Lucy in my notes. I documented the coping strategies given to Lucy. I feel privileged at being asked to support Lucy over such a lengthy period and to support Lucy over these very hard times for her. The whole process was very difficult for me, especially with the process taking so long. So you can see here that this is very strong testimony about how emotional Lucy was, how much she was distressed, the empathy that she showed. And also, even today, Kathryn will say, I feel privileged to have supported Lucy. She didn't state during the thorough inquiry at any stage that she still believes her to be innocent, but there was a very strong implication that she doesn't believe her to be a bad person and that she finds it hard to believe that she has committed these crimes. And she gave a very strong account of herself during Thirlwell as well, that we'll look at now. So what emerged during the Thirlwell inquiry is that Kathryn de Beger clearly formed a very strong and close relationship and bond with Lucy Letby. Although Lucy had been very close to her colleagues, she probably kept, during the period where she was suffering, certainly, Kathryn de Beger probably became closer to Lucy than anyone else on the unit. That's not least because Lucy was isolated from her colleagues, as has been made very clear from documents submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry. So here, Kathryn de Beger is explaining that the closeness of their relationship was not normal. She had WhatsApp conversations with Lucy, and she mentions here that she'd not been in contact in a WhatsApp group with any other member of staff, but I'd not been supporting staff in this situation ever before, and I felt at that time that I was the only support that Lucy Letby had. I was given that role by the trust to support her mental health, to support her well-being going through what I thought at the time was a very distressing situation, and it was given to me to support her the best that I could and keep her in work to maintain her mental health during that period, and I felt that fell just on me. So in order to do that, I did that to the best of my ability, and that was why there were so many messages to try and make sure that she was okay. And all the messages can't be about mindfulness and coping strategies to keep her grounded and keep her in the moment. It was about normal events as well. So clearly they had a close relationship, a lot of messages going back and forth, a lot of discussion about the emotions that Lucy was going through. And yet, despite all of this closeness and despite all these messages, and despite the fact this was an unusual level of closeness, Kathryn de Beger never had any bad feelings. And of course, she would have known a little bit about what was going on in the background and Lucy's suspension, and yet she never suspected anything. She never felt any need to report anything. And at the end of it, she still, to this day, has a positive view of Lucy as a human being. So she just reiterates here that she set up this WhatsApp contact to enable Lucy to contact her whenever she needed to, even if that was outside of her working hours. And she mentions here, anybody attending an occupational health appointment can bring somebody with them, so they could bring their partner, if they bring the union rep or the manager. And this is in reference to Lucy, I think, bringing her parents to an occupational health meeting. And obviously she was in a very distressed state and needing the support at that time. Now, and in this case, Lucy Letby rang me from home asking to see me and asking whether she could bring her mother with her, so I agreed because that is my standard practice. So that's just Kathryn explaining that. I can only take it on that at the meeting that I had with Lucy Letby, she spoke about being particularly distressed that week because it was, as she recalled, an anniversary of one of the baby's deaths. But we then would have a meeting that was just about her managing her feelings, her symptoms, and talking about coping strategies. So again, this gives an indication as to why Lucy may have searched for babies or parents at certain times, because she was, quote unquote, particularly distressed. She's going through constant feeling. She's in a very emotional state at this point. She's very upset. She feels very much under pressure. She's been isolated from her colleagues and friends. She knows the accusations that are flying around about her. So very natural that she would be emotional, and of course she was. But even in this state, it's clear that she still felt great empathy for the parents of the babies and indeed the babies themselves, which is just not consistent with this ridiculous headline that's popped up once in the media based on one anecdote that probably isn't even accurate in the first place, that Lucy's cold and unemotional. It's just categorically untrue. it's completely unsupported. There's just no basis to state that she's cold and unemotional. And then I'll just read out the remaining comments from Kathryn de Beger. Again, she's talking here about Lucy being particularly distressed and how much more distressed the parents would be at the loss of the baby. That's how she framed it, and we had no other conversation about that. And then there's another comment here. On April 17th, I believe that mediation between the clinicians and Lucy Letby had broken down, and she was very distressed about that. It was her plan to return to the neonatal unit at the beginning of April, and that had been paused, so she was very upset about that. And I do remember this time she was very distressed, very confused about why she couldn't go back, why it had been paused when it had been planned that she was going back because she'd been visiting the unit. So I felt that was an explanation of all these mixed emotions, and that's what I replied to on her confusion about what was happening. So again, indicative of a lot of emotions at this time. And then she's talking about Lucy feeling self-recriminations about what has occurred because she was distressed and stressed, which is very much consistent with the supposed confession note that has been very much highlighted in the media as well. And Kathryn de Beger just mentions that all the conversations that she'd had with Lucy indicate that she'd always maintained she'd done nothing wrong. She couldn't understand why people were targeting her. Why did the consultants hate her so much? And she just indicates that she heard that many, many times, as you would expect, because she obviously would have felt very emotional about that as well. And then finally, Kathryn de Beger just reiterated that Lucy would constantly state that she'd done nothing wrong and how that made her feel, and she didn't comment about the babies or deaths in any way, apart from obviously she's mentioned these kind of empathic comments about the parents and about the infants. So what you can really reflect from the comments of Kathryn de Beger is that Lucy had a very normal emotional reaction. There were no red flags. It was all very normal behaviour. If anything, she was extremely distressed, as you would expect. She was still concerned about the parents. She was still concerned about the babies. This would all be considered very healthy behaviour for a nurse or someone in a caring profession, and indicative of someone who's ideal for that kind of role. So it really is kind of heartbreaking when you see an image like that from Lucy's early life, and when you hear about her path through life. There's a very good video by Jabe on this that's, frankly just really upsetting, because you just see she was just such a normal person. Obviously quite a strong person, given that she can go and work on a neonatal unit, which you have to be, but quite a soft, feminine person in many ways, I would say. Just very caring. Dawn Howe describes her as gentle. And you just see her path through life of wanting to be a nurse, working really hard to do it. There's the notice that her parents are sent to local paper when she passes a nursing degree because they're so proud of her. She's doing the work she wants. She's bought a house. She's just progressing through life. I'm sure that hopefully it'll come for her in the future. Hopefully this can be resolved and she can still lead a life. Obviously there's been a big dent put in her life, but I'm sure she would have found a partner. I'm sure she would have had a family that she obviously wanted, because she didn't even redecorate the nursery in her house. It's devastating. And to have people lining up in the press to make comments about her that are completely unfounded it must be really heartbreaking for her as someone who wants to be a good person, basically. So when I've been writing my book and when I've been working on this channel, I've really tried to keep the human aspect out of it as much as possible, particularly in my own mind, because I need to be laser focused on the facts and learning as much about the case I possibly can and making sure that I know it inside out. Can't really think about how unjust and unfair this all is, just need to focus on what I need to convey. But occasionally the human cost and the enormity of the whole situation will hit me, and it's just devastating. And I think it's crystal clear, I'm certain that it's crystal clear from this video, that Lucy was not cold, was not unemotional, she didn't have borderline personality disorder, she's not a psychopath, she's just a perfectly normal young woman who went into nursing because she had an incident when she was a child and she wanted to help others, but she'd been helped herself. And that's what she was doing, and she was highly regarded. And everyone that knows her said she was either normal or actually quite an emotional person. And in fact, this comment made by Nicola Lightfoot is just complete bollocks, frankly. And I do think that she should know better than making this remark. It's doubtful that it's even an accurate memory, let alone that it's accurate of her as a whole. So I hope this video categorically refutes that what I consider to be completely unfounded allegation. Lucy Letby was not cold or unemotional, quite the opposite. She was very empathic. She was a very emotional person. She's a very caring person. And I'm sure that currently she's wondering how she ended up in the situation she is now, having done nothing wrong, when it's becoming really obvious that she was innocent, and that what we have done here as a society is sentence a good person, a caring person, someone who's in a profession that we really need, for this really punishing, brutal sentence.